Hello everyone, welcome to another Overrated Film Saturday, and today I'm going to be diving into the 2004 Phantom of the Opera, or as the real title is called, The Phantom of the Opera, but this one was directed by Joel Schumacher. It's pretty much panned by critics. I mean, critics were very uh, dissatisfied with this particular film, and I can understand that criticism, but it still seemed to, I think, maintain within more of the audience community some kind of enjoyment, at least. At least I think audiences thought it was um, not as bad as the critics were making it out to be, and actually thought it was a rather decent film, to say the least. And it did make a significant chunk of change when it initially came out at the box office. And I remember people in my school were literally talking about this film. And they sort of got, I think, even introduced to Phantom of the Opera based upon this film, because this film kind of introduced a whole new generation of people into Phantom of the Opera, because Phantom of the Opera wasn't really necessarily known by the younger generations, I think, as much. So to have it sort of seen playing out at the big screen was actually something that allowed people to get invested and actually enjoy Phantom of the Opera and maybe even go see the musical and whatnot. And I think it's definitely safe that it did have that effect on the people, and I think that's why it maintained, at least when it came out, a certain level of popularity. And it kind of continued on even maybe a little bit throughout the years. Um, but again, like this video is titled, I think it is overrated. Again, I don't think it is as horrible as the critics like to bash it. I think they really like to be over critical in certain areas, and I think sometimes they can act a little bit, almost a little bit snootish about it. But at the same time, I can understand that this overall, as a adaptation sort of a Phantom of the Opera, it does severely lack in certain areas. However, I wouldn't say I actually agree a lot with what exactly the critics have to say as far as their criticism is concerned. I have my criticisms genuinely are just based upon something that's sort of a more broader problem, I think, that exists within the film. I think in particular the critics like to point out the singing and how they think the singing is just so horrible and blah 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 blah. And I don't think the singing is all that bad. I mean, it's not in any way, shape, or form as good as obviously some other versions of Phantom of the Opera and the way in which the musical showcases the music. I mean, I understand that that is obviously significantly better, but I don't think it's as horrible. And the way in which the critics almost even make fun of how certain artists kind of sound is, I think, a little bit, it's, I think it's almost a little bit rude on the critics' part to like just make fun of just the way that certain people sing. And then what they'll do is they'll over exaggerate the badness when it really, I don't think, is as horrible. Again, it's not by any stretch of the means perfect, and definitely not of the best out there. But to say that it's to do it in such a to criticize it in such an over exaggerated way that doesn't really resemble what or how exactly the people were actually singing it, it just goes to show you that sometimes I think critics can go a little bit too overboard sometimes. um, I'm talking to you, Doug Walker. But regardless, the main problem I think that this movie has is not the singing, not the acting, not even the sets, or not even in the way the um, film is displayed. Which I think the way in which the film is displayed is pretty generic. I mean, they don't really do anything with the camera all too much. Um, but it just has to do with the fact in which they display the musical some in this way, because it doesn't come off as, it doesn't try to present something new to the table as far as Phantom of the Opera. It just kind of um, plays itself off like it almost is on a stage. Um, and that's kind of an issue, only because when you're trying to do things within the film medium, you kind of have to give off the fact that it is sort of a film. And there were certain parts within this film where I thought it did feel a little bit stagey. It didn't seem like it was like an actual story being shot. It was like, here's your actors, here's your performance. This is okay, this is a musical, even though we're going to make it look kind of staged. And I think that was really the main premise into why a lot of the other stuff within this film doesn't do all too well or doesn't even hold up as well. And again, I think it's just that big part is what really ties everything together within the film and what allows everything else to sort of shine through. And I think the fact that they made it too staged really doesn't add a certain level of interest, I think, in people as far as looking at it as more than just a movie version of a musical. Because I think the last thing you want as a director when you hear reviews coming out of this movie is to say, yeah, it was like a staged version of Phantom of the Opera. You don't want to get that vibe, because then why did you make this film? They could have just gone and saw the musical. I mean, it doesn't really add anything to the table as far as the musical. So that's what I think was really not allowing this film to really get the real meat of what really could have elevated it from it just being somewhat more generic. Uh, and I think there are some other things that, again, could have been done obviously a little bit better too as well. Like Christine and Raul's love is pretty bland. I don't know how exactly it is portrayed within the musical because I've not seen the musical. But I would say that they definitely kind of needed to make their love a little bit more believable, especially when they're supposed to be singing such powerful music and it just kind of comes off like, wait, you were only in like 2 scenes together and you were like barely talking, so what's the point? Especially if you're doing it in the form of like this very sort of, I guess, very passionate duet, I guess. Uh, so it just kind of doesn't register itself well. I think you can get away with this kind of stuff if you're doing it um, doing it through like a fairy tale perspective. Um, See, I think this really actually works more so well with in films like, for example, Snow White, where the prince is singing to Snow White because he's just passionately exclaiming himself to her, more to speak, and she's sort of just taking it in and enjoying it, as opposed to two people who are supposed to be singing about something that's supposed to be very intimate, and you don't really see the intimacy there. Um, so again, I think that that's why I'm trying to make a distinction as far as the difference here. So again, I think had there been a little bit more to them, it would have come off as a little bit more genuine. And they always make Raul kind of unlikable, almost, I'd say. So I think had they also kind of made him a little less bland too, probably would have helped. But the thing is, the thing too that I think has to be noted, as far as understanding why this film is a little bit overpraised, is the fact that I understand why certain people would gravitate to liking Gerard Butler, excuse me, because he is very suave. He tries to be very sophisticated and brooding, mysterious, all that. Um, and I don't think his voice is terrible. Again, like there's some critics, I think, that like to really exaggerate, how bad Gerard Butler is. Oh my gosh, he's so horrible. Oh my god, we're all gonna die. And to me, it's not horrible, but it's just not great. It. it has its points where I think his voice shines more so than other points, because you kind of see how he tries to be a little bit over dramatic. There are points where his acting is kind of a little bit too over the top, and it comes off as kind of cheesy and, not as genuine. And I think that with the Phantom, you did have to have a sort of balance to where you were kind of brooding and mysterious, but you wouldn't like over exaggerate maybe certain parts of the musical. And here, I think this comes through in Gerard Butler's singing and also through his acting as well. So I think he really over exaggerated his parts, and I think he could have come off as a lot more genuine had he kind of toned himself down a bit. Um, and I think, that comes through with sometimes his singing too, and how he kind of stretches things out a little bit in such an odd way. And you know that he's genuinely trying, but you know that it just doesn't come off as good had he done it in a different way. And I think had he been given a little bit more direction, I think he could have genuinely pulled it off. I just think there's just certain parts to where, it sounds all right, and then it goes into a certain direction, and then it just sounds a little bit, over dramatic, cheesy, and it just doesn't come off as genuine, and it kind of comes off as very just odd. Um, and some people, I think, like to complain about, in particular, Christine's singing. Emmy Rossum, in this case, is the actress who played her. Again, I don't think she's that bad. I don't think she's as horrible as these critics make her out to be. I mean, I think, obviously, she should have done some work as far as in the acting department, because she just kind of comes off as innocent and bland. I think she should have acted a little bit more terrified and confused. But I think she was really good at being sort of having that innocent quality to her. And I think having that innocence within the singing actually comes off rather effectively. It's just that other aspect of her character, I think, needed to be there. And you could have had a genuine balance, I think, to the point where she has this level of innocence to her. She has this level of maybe naivete, but then she also she's genuinely terrified and confused and maybe even lost, all of that. I think that could have come off more so to her character as well. So again, she wasn't, I think, horrible, and I don't think anybody was necessarily horrible. They just weren't great. They just weren't. There's just nothing genuinely special about these performances, about the acting, or about the singing, about the way in which the film was, kind of really directed, even with the way in which they just make everything feel like kind of like a stage, and not as they don't make it seem like, it's like, they don't make it seem like a film that's trying to be musical, they just make it a musical that's trying to be like a film, and that just doesn't come off that good. But genuinely, I think, like a lot of the films that I talk about on my channel that I mentioned that I think are overrated, I think that this one, again, it's okay. It's like in the maybe 60-70% range. Critics like to make it 30, and I think that is a little bit way too harsh. Like some other films that I've talked about where I think they really just pan it so horribly. Instead of trying to look at something that was genuinely good about it, they just completely pan it. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that I think a lot of critics probably did see the musical. They did know about Phantom of the Opera. They had a genuine understanding of what was supposed to be executed as far as a film is concerned with this. And I think this is why there's more of a huge genuine disappointment from this film by critics than I think general audiences. And I can understand why some of the general audiences really gravitated towards this film, because they never seen Phantom of the Opera, they never really understood the story or the really the premise that was supposed to be behind Phantom of the Opera, and to see something as, to see something very interesting that's very uh, kind of brooding and really well composed as far as music is concerned, I could understand why people would be sort of very impressed by the film because of that, because of the really the musical that the film was kind of going by. So again, I don't think it's as bad, but I don't think it's as good either. So it's sort of, I'm sort of in the middle road for this, but I definitely would say it's not that impressive when you look at other musicals that have been done um, that are put onto the silver screen and made into a film like this. And this goes to show to people that 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 especially the more modern day musicals that they're trying to come out with, there seems to be this genuine lack of authenticity that was grasped in a lot of other more traditional type films that were musicals, or at least films that were using a musical and use that as the premise for their film. All of that is just it, that is all. I think that's just something that that was just I think it was just done a lot better within the past than it has been done so nowadays. Um, Unfortunately, I don't think it's really even that utilized all that much. We don't really, I think, even have that many musicals that are films anymore. And I think there's an understanding to that because I think, especially the very artsy types and people who really genuinely like going and seeing musicals, they'll just go see the musical. Unless it's a very, very famous material. And I think Phantom of the Opera, although it had some genuine fame, um, this film, I think, elevated it only because it wasn't made into a film yet, and people wanted to see how they could do it as far as adapting it from the musical. Um, and obviously, Long Chaney's version of Phantom of the Opera is way better. But this, even though it has its problems, it's still, I think, entertaining to say the least. And again, there's a lot of things that you could argue as to whether or not this could have been changed, this could have been done differently, this could have, made the film better. But I think overall, the things that I've laid out, I think, explain why it was overrated, and also um, why I think the critics sometimes, even though I think they have good, genuine criticism of it, I think it's a little bit over exaggerated. But I think that's all I can ultimately say about this particular film. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.